Self-mastery. You see, in order to achieve self-mastery, we must first develop discipline. And you see, I believe that the best place where discipline can be cultivated is within solitude. And I think that as a man and as a person in general, or as an individual who is interested in personal development, you should embrace solitude. You should embrace being alone. And know that in solitude, you are not necessarily alone in the negative sense, but what you should do, or rather how you should view solitude, is a chance to gain perspective on yourself and on the world around you. You should use solitude as an opportunity to peer into yourself. You should use it as a moment of introspection. And you should take advantage of solitude because I believe that solitude is a gift. It is a gift that is given to us seldom. You see, it isn't the case, especially in modern day society, that we get to be alone often. You see, we are always surrounded by chaos, by obstreperousness, and garrulous people. We are always surrounded by society. And if, by some random chance, the universe or God gives you this blessed gift of solitude, I say that you should embrace it. That you should hold it dearly and use it as a chance to learn, to grow, and individuate. You see, solitude, I believe, is extremely important. But I think for some reason, especially in modern day society, with our independence on electronics, mobile devices, social media, apps, parties, and things of that nature, you see, with our reliance on this, we somehow think of solitude as a bad thing. We do not want to be alone. In fact, most people fear being alone. They view it as a terrible thing, an agonizing thing. They cannot simply sit with themselves. Because, why? Well, I would say it is a multitude of things, but I think one of the most important things to pay attention to, and the reason why I think people are incapable of sitting by themselves and being alone in solitude, is because they are afraid to look at themselves. Because you see, when you are alone and in solitude and there is silence and nothing going on, you can only hear your own thoughts. Your thoughts are no longer drowned out by the other people and other things going on around you. And this could be extremely scary for some people. Because when you are left with yourself, all you can hear, as I said, is your thoughts. And sometimes these thoughts that you are having are invasive. And they can ultimately lead to a state where your mind is perpetually perturbed. And of course, this causes anxiety and depression and all sorts of horrible things in terms of mental anguish. But you see, I believe that this is a necessary step and the first step in the process. You see, if you are one of these people who cannot endure solitude, I believe that you must put yourself in solitude so that you can, as I previously elucidated, individuate, as Jung would call it, or undergo the process of transmutation, alchemical transmutation of the psyche. And you see, the reason why, if you are one of these people who is incapable of enduring solitude, the reason why I believe there are these invasive, intrusive, horrible, agonizing thoughts is because you are in the first initial stage of transformation. The blackening, the negredo, the calcinadio, as the alchemists would call it. The burning. You see, In this initial stage, it might be rather uncomfortable. But you see, this uncomfortability is something that you must endure, because if you do, in fact, endure it, what will happen is you will start to burn everything up. All of the unpropitious propensities within yourself, all of the unconducive proclivities, all of the horrible and terrible idiosyncrasies that you possess, all of the inadequacies, your weaknesses, these will become conspicuous to you. But, as I said, this is important and an essential step in the process. You must endure this. And believe me, if you do endure this and you get through it, you will come out on the other side. You see, I think it's almost in alignment with what Nietzsche was talking about when he said, the thing that is lovable about man is that he is a bridge and not a goal. You see, there is a continual battle in the psyche between the lower and the higher self, the so-called animalistic and the divine. And you see, the lower self, or the animalistic side of the self, of the psyche, is agonizing. It has a lot of mental images that aren't necessarily fun to experience, let's say. And then on the other side, there is the divine, the righteous, the greatest good, your highest self. And you see, I believe that it is important to experience anxiety, depression, anguish. It is important to experience these emotions, because I believe that in order to transcend, you must experience these things, these unfavorable emotions. Because if you feel these emotions, you're going to feel inclined to separate yourself from them, or rather, transform them in a way where you no longer feel that way towards them. Because anxiety is no fun. Depression, no fun. But this is important for the human. Because, you see, through these feelings, we must develop discipline and faith. And we must push forward so that we can succeed and achieve what we want. I think this is what Soren Kierkegaard was kind of talking about. Or I think he kind of believed that faith is important, but also anxiety is extremely important for the human, because we need it in order to transcend. This is kind of what we use to create meaning, right? So it's like, if we experience anxiety, depression, or angst is what Kierkegaard would call it. If we experience this, well, obviously, we're going to naturally feel inclined to want to escape that feeling. And this is sort of the existential crisis that we face. And this is the existential crisis that all people face. And you see, this is inherently where the term existentialism came from, which is sort of a branch of nihilism. But you see, and Nietzsche was talking about this in his Will to Power, where he said that nihilism is the first step in the process. You see, in a way, at least through my readings of Nietzsche, for some reason, I believe that he was somehow surreptitiously an alchemist. Or at least he was aware of alchemy, because you see, if you read his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, it seems to be almost a retelling of the alchemical process of transmutation. At least that's what I took from it. Maybe he wasn't aware of this, and maybe this is just the inherent story within human beings and within the psyche that we continuously retell. I don't know, but if I had to take a wild guess, I would say that Nietzsche was definitely aware of alchemy, and it probably was something that he paid attention to. Especially considering the fact that his philosophy was Heraclitean in a way, because he was inspired by Heraclitus. And in a lot of ways, Heraclitus was akin to the alchemist because he believed that everything was fire, that all things return to fire, and that everything is in flux, continuously changing, and unequivocally contradictory, meaning that the only reason that we have an idea of something is because we have the idea of the opposite of that thing, which is kind of what Nietzsche was talking about in his book Beyond Good and Evil, and also what Heraclitus was talking about when he said, "I am as I am not." You see, what he means when he says, "I am as I am not," is that language is fundamentally predicated on contradictions. You see, there is what you might call categories, and we use categories to describe things. We use the category good to describe all good things. And on the contrary, we use the category bad or evil to describe all things evil and malevolent. But you see, this begins to become an ethical question and a moral one, because to use the category good is what Kant would say disconnected from the thing in itself. You see, if someone does something, if they commit, if they do something, if they take action, you see, the action that they're doing maybe in other contexts would be perceived as good, but maybe in other contexts it would be perceived as bad. But you see, this is why I think that it becomes an ethical and a moral question, and why I think using categories to describe things is essentially erroneous, which basically means that all language is a lie, which is, I think, something that Terence McKenna was also talking about. Or at least I think that's something I remember from Terence McKenna, where he said that all language is a lie. And you see, there is something interesting about that statement. And you see, I avoided the word truth there. I didn't want to say that there's something true about it. Because you see, if I was to say that there was something true about it, well, of course, I would be contradicting myself, because if it's true, then it can also be false. But you see, this is why I say that there's something interesting about that statement. I don't want to necessarily say that it is something or it isn't something, but that rather it's just interesting. That it's thought-provoking. And you see, I think this is a good place to be. To view all things as thought-provoking, and not develop convictions about something. You see, as Nietzsche also said, that the only thing more dangerous to truth than lies are convictions. But you see, even in that statement alone, he is contradicting himself. Because you see, in order to have the idea that someone has a conviction, you can have the idea that they are also not convinced. And this is why language is interesting. You see, and I think it's all very interesting, because it questions our idea of what truth is. And you see, truth is an extremely perplexing notion. It's like, what is truth? Well, surely we have our ideas of what truth is. We have political parties. There's philosophers. There's truth everywhere. Everyone believes that what they are saying is correct. Because, for some reason, it seems to me at least that humans' reason and the intellect is inherently dogmatic. We become convinced through our own egoism, I think. Because, for some reason, the ego, or the mind, or the brain, or the intellect, or whatever you want to call it, wants to believe in things. And it wants to believe that it is right. And of course, I can only recognize this in other people because I recognize it in myself. Surely I have convictions. Surely I do. And I think we all do. But I think it is important to realize that, well, maybe you do have convictions, but I think we should look at these convictions that we have and try to think about why we have these convictions, but also maybe this is impossible. Because even if we think Heracliteanly, if we have the idea that we can understand something, and we can become conscious of it, well then also there are parts that are unconscious to us. Which is kind of what Carl Jung was talking about when he said something like, where understanding is gained, knowledge is lost. And this is kind of the yin-yang of consciousness and unconsciousness, right? The light and the darkness. It's like, once you make the claim that you understand something, understanding seems to represent consciousness. And knowledge or wisdom in this statement seems to represent unconsciousness. At least this is my interpretation of it. I do not know if that was what Carl Jung was saying exactly, but at least that is what I have taken from it. That when we understand things, we become conscious of it. And this could be what you might call reason or truth. But wisdom is beyond truth. It's unconscious. It's some sort of intuition. And sometimes intuition seems to be stronger than understanding or reason or truth, even for that matter. You see, we are intuitive beings to a certain extent, but we also like to believe that we can deconstruct the world into smaller and smaller bits and claim that we understand it. And you see, it's actually very interesting, because I've recently started to read the Fragments by Heraclitus. And it's actually quite interesting because in the introduction, they were talking about how basically by saying that these are only fragments of his writings, right? It's saying that that the whole thing, the whole piece is missing. But you see, Heraclitus' philosophy, essentially, was predicated on the belief, or rather, the idea that everything is in a continuous state of flux. That nothing is ever whole or concrete. As Alfred North Whitehead said, who was actually influenced by Heraclitus in many ways, that in the inescapable flux, there is something that abides. In the overwhelming permanence, there is an element that escapes into flux. Permanence can be snatched out of the flux. In the passing moment, can find its adequate intensity only by its submission to permanence. And you see, when Whitehead said that, that's basically Heraclitean. And I think, and Whitehead would call this the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Because you see, we can speak concreteness into things, but when we speak concreteness into something, we are simultaneously speaking ephemeralness into it. We're revealing its transitory nature by also revealing its concreteness or its solidity. You see, there is always a contradiction, and there are always opposites. There is a tension. You see, there is always a tension within the psyche. This is, I believe, how the psyche is structured. If we think about the idea of man being a bridge and not a goal, this seems to reveal the idea of there being a tension within the psyche, between the lower and the higher. There's always two opposing forces. We cannot have the idea good without bad, male without female, cold without hot. These are fundamental axioms, not only of lexicography, but of the psyche, I think, in the way that it's structured, in the way that it seems to label the world, in a way where reality seems to become assimilable to it. Our psyche, our mind, and our intellect, our consciousness. And you see, this is something that I've been thinking about. And it's something that I'm going to continue to think about. And it's something that I wanted to share with you because I think that when you have ideas and you believe them to be profound and thought-provoking and interesting, I believe that it is your duty to share that gift with the world. To add to it. To offer value. And this is exactly what I'm trying to do. And I believe that as a person, as an individual, as a male or a female, if you have something that you feel as if you want to share, I say that you should share it. Because you see, if we have something that is valuable, I think that we should share it with the world. But this does not mean that we should become excessively talkative or reveal too much of ourselves. You see, I think we should share our ideas with the world, our gifts, our philosophy, our art, things of that nature. But when it comes to personal matters, I believe that that should be concealed from the world. You see, I'm merely talking about ideas. Abstract ideas, art, thought, philosophy, literature, things of that nature. But you should never reveal your interpersonal relationships with the world. You should keep them private, because that is in fact what they are, private. Nonetheless, in this world, there are contradictions, and the tension of opposites seem to prevail in all things. This seems to be inescapable. You see, this is kind of what Alfred North Whitehead was saying when he said, in the inescapable flux, there is something that abides. You see, we cannot escape these opposites, these inherent contradictions. They seem to be, for some reason, fundamental. They are axioms, maybe not of nature itself, but certainly of language. But I think also of nature, because you see, if you go out into nature and you observe it, you will see that where there is water, there is a hard surface underneath. This is what the water flows on top of. The water can be perceived as soft, I guess, in a way. And the rock underneath, hard. See, this is the opposites. Trees are hard and they grow out of the soft ground. Soft, hard. Contradiction. Opposites. There seems to be opposites everywhere, right? Which is interesting. And I believe that it's something that you should pay attention to. And this is certainly something that I pay attention to. Because when you start to pay attention to these things, you begin to understand the world in a way that you didn't understand it before. And that's interesting. And I think that life, and the life that we are living, should be interesting. It should be thought-provoking and profound. And I believe that knowledge, or wisdom, is a form of wealth. And if you're going to seek any sort of wealth whatsoever, let it be that. Do not get caught up in material possessions and the desire for opulence or ostentatiousness. Rather, be okay with having nothing in terms of material, but having something more valuable, I think. Wisdom. Wisdom to me seems to be more valuable because this can actually make you happy, or rather content. I think it was Seneca who said, "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who desires more that is poor. And that's what I want to leave off with.